Hey everyone, I'm Brett Scott. I'm the author of Cloud Money and the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. And in this 7-part series, I'm going to take you from the ground level of our economy all the way through up to the highest levels of global corporate capitalism. This has been made in collaboration with Lankelly Chase. This is part 7 of 7. So, let's begin. So when we start to make claims about changing capitalism, what we're often really talking about is shifting the relative strength of different bundles of forces in our economic web. Now, one of the greatest problems we have in doing this, however, is that this superorganism that we're part of, this economic superorganism, is so large and complex that most people can't understand it. And even if they do understand it, they may disagree on where its problems lie. And even if they can agree on where its problems lie, they'll often find it hard to get consensus on what to change. And even if they can get consensus, they find it very hard to coordinate that plan and to overcome resistance to it, to prevent adaptations occurring in the system that will neutralize or thwart them in some kind of way. So let's look at 5 different paradigms of change that might spring out of this position. Paradigm 1. Going with the dominant flow, market solutions. So if you're stuck in a type of mentality of capitalist realism, which is the sense that there's no other possible way of being that is conceivable, the most obvious path is to seek market solutions to problems that you see. These will actually appear as the only realistic option that you have. And this kind of often will give rise to a type of shallow solutionism, in which you attempt to use the forces of market capitalism to fix itself. Now, within our economic system, the default course of behavior is monetary accumulation. And superficially, it then makes sense that people try to then work with this default. Now, this outlook is very, very common in, for example, the sustainable capitalism space, where sustainability practitioners will try to showcase the business case for environmental sustainability. Because they know that very often big corporate managers can't act or do anything unless it can be justified in monetary terms to their shareholders. So they must show how the profit motive can be aligned with some sustainable outcome. Here's the Harvard Business School doing just that. Now, it's very easy to detect the presence of this paradigm because it often comes along with certain key phrases and jargon, such as negative externalities. This is a piece of economics jargon that refers to something bad that happens to someone else somewhere that we cannot feel, or that the producer of something cannot feel. So, for example, communities downriver of a big chemical plant being polluted, while the shareholders of that plant can't experience that, or can't see that, or can't, quote unquote, internalize that. So the imagined counter to this is incentives. If you want to make the system move towards something good, place some kind of monetary gain there. And this is what the phrase business case actually means. It often involves showcasing the monetary gain that might stem from doing good, or the monetary loss from doing bad. Another classic example of this type of paradigm is the natural capital community, where people attempt to put monetary prices onto ecological systems so that they can be legible or visible to a dominant system that's basically blind to unpriced things. Now, this is a very controversial area because it sends a cultural message that seems to accept and even endorse the priority of market logic over all else. Now, hybridized versions of this thinking also bleed into the social enterprise space, where business cases for providing traditionally unprofitable services, such as healthcare for poorer people, are made. You also find it in the ethical investment space, where fund managers attempt to show that an investor can do well by doing good, with good being measured by ESG, environmental, social, and governance indicators. Incidentally, you'll notice right now that the Trump administration is heavily attacking ESG. Basically, they want old school capitalism without the pretense of doing good. Now, it's easy to critique market solutions, but it's important to realize that these attempts to fight fire with fire often make sense to people who are immersed in market logic. and also have to survive by continuing to earn income. So many people will indeed attempt to continue existing in a normal market system while trying to use its processes to fix various aspects of it. Paradigm 2: managing and reforming. So market solutions are often pitched by people who are immersed within this kind of capitalist realist mentality where they imagine that capitalism is natural and unstoppable and that the only thing you can ever do is to go with its natural flow. But of course, modern corporate capitalism has a political foundation, so there really isn't a clear natural version of it. So an alternative paradigm that springs out of this involves recognizing that political foundation and attempting to alter the political structures that underlie modern capitalism. Now, this is what drives many reformist movements who call for regulations and policies to steer capitalism in a more positive direction or to manage its excesses. This is also the dominant mode by which the economy is spoken of in official political circles. So proposing economic policies, laying out 30-year decarbonization plans, or debating agricultural subsidies and so on are the day-to-day life of politicians. But there are very different levels of radicalism that can be found in these proposals. So some regulations are superficial attempts to make capitalism a bit nicer, while other measures like renationalization of a railway system, for example, might have significant structural effects. Attempts to manage capitalism like this are obvious in overt problem-solving projects, such as the global effort to mitigate or adapt to climate change. Beyond this, however, there are whole philosophies of managed capitalism, such as ordoliberalism in Europe, which is associated with the social market economy that is supposed to tread a kind of middle ground between free market capitalism and social democracy to produce some kind of inclusive capitalism. Now, another prominent tradition of semi-managed capitalism is Keynesianism. This school of thought rejects the idea of natural market order and aims to proactively pull government financial levers to affect markets. This is often imagined as a way to secure the good life for the widest range of people, helping them to have a dignified job and growing protections. Now, Keynesianism doesn't attempt to overthrow capitalism, but tries to prevent shocks to market life, especially for the most vulnerable, and also to redistribute power in various ways. Now, the left wing of this tradition nowadays turns up in the MMT, or modern monetary theory community. So rather than seeing scarcity in the world in monetary terms, MMT proponents see it in real resource terms. They basically recognize that the true scarcity in our world is not money, but rather the underlying people and ecologies. And from this perspective, they then strategize about how to use or mobilize the state monetary system to direct people and resources towards producing social goods like healthcare for the poor, or education, or decarbonization of the energy grid. If we return to the metaphor of money as a kind of nervous system, the MMT movement is sort of trying to create some democratic mobilization of that nervous system. Another framing for left-leaning people who want to manage capitalism is Kate Raworth's donut economics, where she provides a useful model for treading a kind of middle ground between providing for the needs of humanity and protecting the ecology. This donut concept is quite useful because it concedes that we need to create things and have resources and try to improve our livelihoods in various ways. And that's the kind of baseline hole in the donut, the minimum amount that you need. But then there's these ecological boundaries, these types of limits that we can't go past. So there's a sort of sweet spot where you can try to have a balanced and healthy economy. Anything below that is too little, and anything above that's too much. And that's the basic donut economics concept. Paradigm 3: rejecting and replacing. The traditions of anti-capitalism. So there's a very complex history of left-wing anti-capitalist thought, but the most prominent strand of radical left thought has been Marxism. Now, Marxism often generates an imagination that looks something like this poster, this sort of idea of breaking of chains. Now, during the course of this video series, we've seen various network diagrams that try to visualize the interdependent market economy. But through the Marxist worldview, those images of entanglement will also be seen as images of imprisonment, essentially, with working classes stuck in these invisible relations of domination with ownership classes. Marxism also operates through dialectics, which is a way of thinking in which one system is seen to contain its own antithesis. So one system like capitalism is seen to contain these seeds of its opposite. So there's this kind of angsty vibe that I was hinting at earlier with the snake trying to eat itself. And this is imagined to lead eventually to the emergence of systemic contradictions that will eventually break the structure and cause it to reconfigure. Now, this breaking point is the imagined revolution in Marxism, where the workers rise up against the capitalists. But there are wildly different interpretations of what that's supposed to look like. And modern capitalism has also shifted a lot since Marx's time, so the theory is constantly morphing or being adapted. Now, some left-wing thinkers believe that capitalism will naturally give rise to some new system. It's a bit like a caterpillar transforming through some kind of painful transition into a butterfly. Now, others have historically called for active resistance to capitalism, to transform it more forcefully. So there's been this long debate that's gone on in left-wing circles about whether or not notorious leaders like Stalin and Mao can actually even be considered Marxists, because they try to force a revolution onto a society that wasn't ready for it. A bit like trying to force an immature caterpillar to become a butterfly, and failing at that. Now, in the situation of capitalist realism, where you can't really imagine exiting this type of all-immersive system, this is often somewhat intellectual, because most Marxists have often been pushed to the sidelines of left-leaning politics and been replaced with these managerial reformers like mainstream Keynesians or centrist Blairites in places like the UK. Now, a key difference between a managerial reformer and a revolutionary Marxist is that the former believes in basically working alongside the systemic processes of capitalism to manage or intervene. The latter, by contrast, either believes in directly going against the systemic processes to fight it, this is kind of like anti-capitalism, or actually sometimes in heavily accelerating those processes to cause the caterpillar to transform more quickly. This is sometimes called left-wing accelerationism. Now, that kind of radical anti-capitalism and left-wing accelerationism might look like they're almost diametric opposites, with one wanting to pull the system back and another wanting to accelerate it forward. But actually, both imagine themselves as trying to transform the entire structure of an economy into a new butterfly, as it were. That said, people on the political left often combine various aspects of these traditions. They might work towards certain managerial reforms, certain forms of Keynesian interventions, for example, while resisting corporate interests, which is a kind of anti-capitalist tradition, and potentially advocating for progressive versions of, say, AI or other digitization technology, which you might see in left-wing accelerationism. Paradigm 4. Counterbalancing. Now, counterbalancing is perhaps the most muddy category, because many of the aforementioned paradigms could also claim to be counterbalancing our dominant system. Perhaps the core tension revolves around whether a movement imagines itself as transforming our system from a caterpillar into some kind of future butterfly, or whether it imagines itself like a kind of opposing strand in a web, providing a counterweight to some antagonistic force. So counterbalancing has that latter feeling. For example, people who push for small local currencies or small-scale cooperatives or peer-to-peer finance or community permaculture might perceive themselves as creating these small strands of resistance that pull as a counterweight against the dominant economy. Now, many people who are involved in those types of things don't necessarily imagine that their efforts will cause the entire world to reconfigure into some kind of utopia of pure economic localism or something. But they do actually see themselves as providing some kind of partial bottom-up counterpower to this dominant system. Now, there are many traditions of this sort of bottom-up counterbalancing across the political spectrum, from socially conservative farmers' cooperatives and religious communities like the Amish, to left-wing communes, hippie eco-villages, and intentional communities, which incidentally also play a core role in the festival circuit in places like the UK, which gives some scope for people in cities to temporarily leave a normal market economy and act out these alternative lifestyles. So one thing these groups might align on is that they stand in opposition to dominant corporate capitalism. They're also normally quite detached from and often quite skeptical of the various top-down managerial efforts to steer capitalism. In fact, this is kind of the original meaning of decentralization. Groups who call for power to be taken away from big, distantly controlled systems and devolved to these sort of smaller, locally controlled subsystems. Now, in the world of finance, this ethos turns up in the world of alternative banking, with local banks and cooperative banks and social banks. It also turns up in alternative currency circles, with local currencies and mutual credit systems. Now, sometimes counterbalancing is framed in permacultural terms, which is a kind of ecological design philosophy that tries to think about how you manage ecosystems in a harmonious way. When you think about things in permacultural terms, you might be thinking about how do you provide a kind of richer ecosystem of players to maintain diversity and resilience in a system. So, the alternative economies scene can actually have quite a lot of political diversity. The more centrist projects often imagine themselves as complementing the mainstream system. So, for example, this phrase complementary currencies. People who build complementary currencies are not necessarily trying to bring down the entire monetary system, but they imagine themselves as complementing it in some kind of way, providing a sort of marginal parallel track. While left-wing anarchist autonomous zones, Christiania in Copenhagen, or Utopias in Vilnius, or Exarchia in Athens, often imagine themselves as citadels of resistance to capitalism, like these enclaves that stand against this dominant force. But actually, that same mentality is often found in breakaway anarcho-capitalist enclaves like Liberland, who imagine themselves as citadels of resistance to states. Now, conservative libertarian projects like that also include things like seasteading, and more recently, the concept of the network state, which is a kind of revised version of libertarian utopianism that's been mixed with blockchain technology. Now, the left-leaning version of that thinking, of those technological movements, includes stuff like platform cooperatives, collaborative finance, or CoFi, and refi, or regenerative finance. These are kind of updated versions of older traditions like collaborative economy, cooperative economy, commons-based economy, and regenerative economy. Let's though look at one last overarching paradigm, which is evolving. So this is a kind of cross-cutting paradigm, and it's this belief that our system can be pushed towards evolving into some new state. Now, as mentioned, there are these versions of this found in Marxist thought, but this strand is also particularly prominent in what's called post-capitalist thinking, in which we are imagined to be moving beyond capitalism. Now, a related vibe is found in what's called metamodernism, which imagines that humanity is moving into a kind of adulthood stage after a more angsty teenage phase of postmodernism, which was pitching itself against early modernism with its belief in progress and industrial domination and separation from nature and the body. Now, in the metamodernist type of scene, there are certain parallels with New Age thinking sometimes, and sometimes these communities blend together. Often in New Age communities, you'll have this imagination of us evolving into some higher state of consciousness. Now, there's some different political tints running through those types of framings, and some of them are pretty dodgy. That said, though, these movements do share a tendency towards moving beyond the contestation that you might find in more straightforward, activisty, anti-capitalist communities. And these sort of evolver type communities will often try to promote these attractive futuristic visions like solar punk. So they cultivate more of this feeling of trying to just build new systems rather than rejecting an older system. A shelf of utopias versus regrowths. Now, people in alternative economy circles are often pushed towards various epic visions of how to fix the economic system. And sometimes these approaches get placed alongside each other, a bit like products we might pick off a shelf with different brands of change that a person can attach their identity to. Maybe you can actually pick a range of these, and there certainly are many intriguing cocktails you can come up with. For example, there are New Age psychedelics practitioners who believe that we're evolving into some higher state of consciousness through cryptocurrency. There are universal basic income or UBI proponents pushing for a rewiring of the market system, mixed with a vision of kind of techno-solutionist abundance. Then you'll find other types of UBI champions who imagine it as leading to degrowth, in which we kind of step back from endless production and reorientate towards leisure and rest. Now, that word degrowth is worth exploring. It's a word that's positioned in opposition to the dominant tendency in our system, which is growth. Now, this is kind of a problematic framing because if you're dealing with people who've become sensitized or socialized into the idea that growth is good, something like degrowth seems bad or it seems like a threat. To use a kind of sensory metaphor, if growth is imagined like sight, degrowth can appear as blindness. Let's imagine, however, if we reframed that word to something else, like re-leisure, for example. Now it starts to have a slightly different feeling to it. In our sensory metaphor, that starts to look a bit like blocked ears opening up so that you can hear again. By using that prefix re rather than de, a kind of different set of values can be showcased. And so this leads to a challenge. Can we redefine our concepts of progress so that people start to believe that there's more than one path going into the future? And much like we have 5 senses, there could be 5 simultaneous concepts of progress at work at different angles to each other, and which might actually contradict each other. Now, we've historically only been focusing on one of these concepts of progress, which is economic growth at all costs. But this concept of progress requires a decrease in many other forms of progress. Maximizing one trajectory of progress comes at the expense of many others. So rather than defining progress as a kind of attempt to maximize one trajectory, we could redefine it as a process of balancing different trajectories with this constant need for regrowths in those areas that we've neglected. This takes us back to David Graeber in the final book that he actually published before he died, along with David Wengrow, which is called The Dawn of Everything. The defining purpose of this book was to free our imaginations from the strictures of traditional Western meta-narratives about the arc of history. That sort of story that, progress is one thing that goes from the past to the future. And it actually encourages us to put those anthropologist goggles on and to see that there's actually multiple arcs. Now, it's true that we have dominant forces in our system, like state-underpinned corporate and financial capitalism, which has historically mapped in complex and toxic ways to things like race and gender. But we also have the ability to alter those forces and to re-emphasize different parts of our being and different conceptions of progress. So, this has been an introductory series, and I've obviously had to gloss over a lot of the complexities and nuances of our system. For example, I haven't actually had a chance to really explain the monetary system in any depth, and that's a huge building block of modern capitalism. We've also only briefly touched upon the financial sector, which is another huge powerhouse in our system. But I'll go into that in future videos, and you can also find more on my site, Asimoko. I really hope that this series has given you some kind of broad scaffolding upon which you can begin to build both a deeper knowledge of the economic world that surrounds us, but also a deeper conviction in your ability to think creatively about how to go about remixing that world. I wish you all the best with that adventure, and I'll do my best to keep on helping you to see all the parallel paths that are available. Keep believing, keep fighting, keep exploring. Much love.